The Atlantic Charter was a statement issued on 14 August 1941 that set out American and British goals for the world after the end of World War II. The joint statement, later dubbed the Atlantic Charter, outlined the aims of the United States and the United Kingdom for the post-war world as follows. No territorial aggrandizement. No territorial changes made against the wishes of the people. Restoration of self-government to those deprived of it. Reduction of trade restrictions. Global cooperation to secure better economic and social conditions for all. Freedom from fear and want. Freedom of the seas. And abandonment of the use of force. And disarmament of aggressor nations. The Charter's adherents signed the declaration by United Nations on 1 January 1942, which was the basis for the modern United Nations. The Charter inspired several other international agreements and events that followed the end of the war, the dismantling of the British Empire, the formation of NATO, and the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, all derived from the Atlantic Charter. In 2021, a document titled the New Atlantic Charter was signed by US President Joe Biden and UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson in their first meeting in Cornwall. The Allies first expressed their principles and vision for the world after World War II in the Declaration of St. James's Palace in June 1941. The Anglo-Soviet Agreement was signed in July 1941 and formed an alliance between the two countries. US President Franklin Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill discussed what would become the Atlantic Charter in 1941 during the Atlantic Conference in Placentia Bay, Newfoundland. They made their joint declaration on 14 August 1941 from the U.S. Naval Base on the Bay. Naval Base Argentia, which had recently been leased from Britain as part of a deal that saw the Americans give 50 surplus destroyers to the British for use against German U-boats. The U.S. did not enter the war as a combatant until the attack on Pearl Harbor. 4 months later, since the policy was issued as a statement, there was no formal, legal document called Atlantic Charter. It detailed goals and aims for the war and for the post-war world. Many of the Charter's ideas came from an ideology of Anglo-American internationalism, which sought British-American cooperation for international security. Roosevelt's attempts to tie Britain to concrete war aims and Churchill's desperation to bind the U.S. to the war effort helped to provide motivations for the meeting that produced the Atlantic Charter. It was assumed at the time that the British and the Americans would have an equal role to play in any post-war international organization that would be based on the Charter's principles. Churchill and Roosevelt began communicating in 1939, the first of their 11 meetings during the war. Both men traveled in secret. Roosevelt was on a 10-day fishing trip. On 9 August 1941, the British battleship HMS Prince of Wales steamed into Placentia Bay with Churchill on board, and met the American heavy cruiser USS Augusta, where Roosevelt and members of his staff were waiting. Once they met, Churchill and Roosevelt were silent for a moment until Churchill said, "At long last, Mr. President." Roosevelt replied, "Glad to have you aboard, Mr. Churchill." Churchill then delivered a letter from King George VI to Roosevelt and made an official statement. But a movie sound crew that was present failed to record it despite 2 attempts. The Atlantic Charter made it clear that the United States supported Britain in the war. Both wanted to present their unity regarding their mutual principles and hopes for a peaceful post-war world and the policies that they agreed to follow once Germany had been defeated. A fundamental aim was to focus on the peace that would follow, not specific American involvement in war strategy. Although American involvement appeared increasingly likely, there were 8 principal clauses of the Charter. The 4th clause, with respect to international trade, consciously emphasized that both, victor vanquished, would be given market access, on equal terms. That was a repudiation of the punitive trade relations that had been established within Europe after World War I, as exemplified by the Paris Economy Pact. When it was released to the public on August 14, 1941, the Charter was titled, Joint Declaration by the President and the Prime Minister, and was generally known as the Joint Declaration. The Labour Party newspaper Daily Herald coined the name Atlantic Charter, but Churchill used it in the British Parliament on the 24th of August 1941, which has since been generally adopted. No signed version ever existed. The document was threshed out through several drafts, and the final agreed text was telegraphed to London and Washington, D.C. Roosevelt gave Congress the Charter's content on the 21st of August 1941. He later said, "There isn't any copy of the Atlantic Charter. So far as I know, I haven't